Well, thank you for joining ROAPE.net. Would you please introduce yourself?
So my name is Muthoni Wanyeki. I come from Kenya. I am a political scientist, but I've worked 20 years or so in the human rights movement, mainly in Africa and more broadly on the continent, and the women's rights movement. Right now I'm working as the Africa Director for the Open Society Foundations Network.
Thank you. And you're attending the second ROAPE workshop on radical transformation, social movements and protest. Would you give us some of your impressions of the workshop? We're in the second day. How have you found it?
I think it's pretty interesting. I like the way it's organized. It's participatory. I like the fact that it's, not to be cliched, intergenerational. I think there's so much to learn from the older generation. Well, I'm considered old now too, so but people, my seniors. Things that really struck me, I guess, were things that came up that people did point out, oh my God, these are old debates, why are we still having them now? So issues of what is the meaning of class in Africa? Where do you see class formations? Where do you see class struggles? Why is it that struggles actually that fundamentally are about people's lived conditions aren't defined in that way? I found that discussion interesting, even if it's been had before. I think probably can't be had enough. I found the intervention on sort of trends and where we see reactions or attempts to be transformative. That sparked off an interesting line of thought in my own head. It's interesting hearing about sort of newer forms that younger students, how they're organizing and what they're thinking of. Of course, this will be read defensively, but I'm curious, I guess, about the sort of real, almost vitriol towards civil society as defined by NGOs and the human rights movement, because certainly, as Yao pointed out, in Ghana and Kenya, the human rights movement, the domestic human rights movement, grew out of the old left, and it was sort of leftists who returned from exile, returned from sort of training for an armed struggle that in our case never happened. And there was a huge debate end of the 80s around how to engage with the sort of democratic kind of process unfolding against military dictatorships across the continent. And of course, military dictatorships, one-party movements, one-party states were why people had been in exile. And the decision was, come above board, let's make use of this new institutional formation, let's try and infuse it with our beliefs and how we think transformation needs to happen. And then you wonder, wow, has none of that work been seen? And I guess for me it made me think about documenting struggle, right? We're here at the University of Dar es Salaam. Everyone knows anecdotally or through being involved in the movement what Dar es Salaam has meant for this sub-region in particular in terms of political change. And similarly, I think about London in the 80s, what that meant for political change, transition across the continent. And I guess sort of in trying to understand this sort of vitriolic reaction, I'm like, wow, maybe it's just that unless you've been involved and you don't see a way to be involved, those struggles and that story isn't really well documented. And so that's what I've been thinking about, sort of how do we tell the story of Akara in the 60s, Dar in the 70s, 80s, London in the 80s, and what that meant for people who did have a will and impetus to address these deep problems in our societies. So yeah, it's been interesting. My mind's been wandering a lot. Yeah.
Thank you very much.